Hello and a very warm welcome to both our panelists and our audience for the second episode in our new series of podcasts, where we talk to professors, directors of incubators, and other founders. Because we at Coubon don't just want to sell our product to you, but more so entertain and educate you. We have with us Professor Rhia Catapano, who's a distinguished professor of marketing in the Rotman School of Management. I've had the great pleasure of learning from her. We also have Yashi, our marketing specialist, who will be joining us in this discussion today. So, Professor, if you could please be kind enough to say 2 lines about yourself for the audience who may not have learned from you yet.
My name is Rhia Catapano. I'm originally from New York. I did my bachelor's degree at Yale in psychology, and now obviously I teach at Rotman and got my PhD from Stanford in marketing. So I spent a lot of time in this area.
I mean, I'm sure our audience would love to hear more about those experiences. So let's start off with the first question. According to you, what makes a successful startup? Because I know you've been in Stanford, and that's considered the mecca of startups. So please enlighten us.
Yeah, definitely. So at Stanford, when we talk about startups, we talk about 2 questions that you need to answer for whether a startup will be successful. And those 2 questions are, 1, is there a market? And 2, will it make money? So I guess first, is there a market? Is a case where you really want to be thinking about what do people actually need, and is this going to satisfy those needs? Because in a lot of cases, what we see in like Silicon Valley is people come up with really cool tech, and that the tech doesn't really do something that people actually need it to do. And founders haven't always figured out how that is going to fit into people's lives and meet an actual need. So I think it's cool for you folks with Coubon that it's people who are the target audience for the product, are the ones who are working on it, which means that it is actually satisfying, like a need that you all know exists for people like you, which is nice, because I think that is a really easy thing for a lot of startups to sort of get caught up in, is like, this is a cool idea, but it's not a cool idea that people necessarily want. So there's no actual market for it. The other thing that we always talk about is, can it make money? Which I think is also nice for you folks in that you're an app, right? When we think about lots of companies, startup costs are obviously high, and then also incremental costs as you grow are really high. So a lot of thought goes into, for a lot of companies, sort of like, is it sustainable? If we manage to get 10,000 consumers, are we going to actually make money with 10,000 consumers? Or are we going to still be losing money because it's so expensive to produce products and, have like factories and things like that for a lot of products? Something that's nice in the app space is that that's really democratized sort of this sort of product creation, because once you create an app, then you can sort of like, you have the app, and then you can scale much more easily than a lot of products where scaling itself can be really, really expensive and like maybe isn't even feasible financially for a company ever.
Agree with what you said, and that's why we at Coubon have made a conscious effort to be flexible. Unlike the larger companies who are rigid in our approach, we know that at the end of the day, we're serving the customers, and whatever it takes to make their lives easier, we're more than happy to do it. And so, in marketing, I know there's a huge emphasis on data and data collection. It's kind of the new fad, as it is too, with many people going into data analytics, data sciences. So how important is data science, both in marketing specifically and also in the large economy and businesses?
Yeah, I think data science has become more and more important sort of in optimizing things for consumers and having things be more personalized to individual consumers, right? At one point, the way that you reach consumers was just to put out a TV ad and reach everyone in the same way. And you created one product for everyone and reached everyone in the same way. But data science is really nice in that companies don't have to just choose one market or even necessarily one product anymore, and can do a much better job in terms of optimizing the products for different groups of people who might use a product differently and want different things out of it, and also reaching people in different ways who might want slightly different things out of the product. So sort of that specialization just makes products like better for people and makes it easier to reach the people who your product will be most useful for.
Yes, and now that you mention it, there are a few things that we are doing in Coubon, which I'm very excited about, which will be available down the pipeline. One of which is creating a heat map. Now, that's something our audience would be familiar with on Snapchat, but this essentially talks about how warm an area is depending on how many users are in that area. And that really helps us because it allows us to target more restaurants in that area to better serve your needs as the customer. We have also got a chat box which uses your data and generative AI to come up with better and more precise recommendations for you. So I think that's really something that data analytics has really helped us do, which perhaps 30, 40 years ago wasn't possible or wasn't feasible.
Like once you have some consumers, like yeah, you know where they are and sort of, yeah, can build up a product that fits your core, the people who are using your product the most better, which yeah, is the great thing about data these days.
Just to follow up on that question, just out of my interest, and I know my audience will also be interested, these big companies like Google and all are often getting criticized for kind of data mining, using your data against your will. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword in that, in one sense, it's there to help you to make the product better for you. And on the other, it's invading their privacy. So what's the balance kind of there, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think a lot of it probably is about companies doing a better job at communicating with consumers in terms of what data they're collecting, how they're anonymizing it, and what they're using it for. I think in a lot of cases, consumers sort of, you get pop-up messages that say, like, can we use your data, accept all? And it's not always clear what exactly that means. Versus in a lot of cases, really all that companies want are super anonymized data, that it doesn't matter who you are, it just matters that there's, a person in this area who did this set of things. And I think the more that consumers realize the benefits to them of sharing their data, but also the ways that their data is being protected, the more likely consumers are to opt in for those things, because I do think that it's important to have those systems be opt-in and not just have companies decide that they think it's for the best for everyone, so they're going to use the data. Obviously, that's a problem. But I think at the end of the day, like apps and products, everything is sort of, it's better for the extra data these companies have in a lot of cases. But yeah, that needs to be communicated to consumers in a way that they can make an informed choice and feel okay about sharing that data and feel okay about getting a better product experience as a result of that data, and actually feel that they get a product experience, right? Like I'm sure you've both experienced where you buy something and then they continue to advertise that same thing to you that you already bought, and you're like, that I bought this. But in a lot of cases, if there's sort of like data blocks where you're not sharing that data, then they don't actually have that information about you, and you'd have a better experience if they stopped advertising that to you. So just, yeah, communicating with consumers better and hopefully getting them to be willing to opt in, I think is sort of what people are thinking about now in terms of marketing in the private space, in the privacy space.
Yashi, would you like to ask any questions?
Yeah, I just had a quick question about how, big companies, they have so much data that they gather, and especially for fields like marketing, they have to target that specific data for them to actually for it to benefit them. So in your experience, how would a lot of companies do that? We have our social media, which collects a lot of data once we're in person, and once we have our ad campaign launch and all of that, there'll just be so much of data that we collect. So how do we know as, a startup to properly filter data and how to know what data to use and what data to not use?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, what you want to think about, so in marketing classes, we always talk about like the funnel of where are you losing people, right? So when you're first starting out, the data that you need is who has any interest at all. And that's the important data, is who has interest. But then as you move forward and sort of mature as a company, obviously at some point, like people know of your app, and then you're sort of figuring out, where are we losing the most people? Do we have a lot of people who are interested in never downloading? Are they downloading it and never using it? Are they using it once and then not returning? And the data that you really care about is, what is the difference between the group of people who don't convert to the step that you need them to, and the people who do actually make that conversion? And why are those two groups different? Is it that your app is better catering to one of those groups and it's actually not doing what the other group needs from it? Is it that you're just not making it easy enough for them to do that? There's too many barriers, too much friction. And sort of, I think at any given moment, which data is important to you is going to evolve with a company in terms of what the most important goal and where you're going to capture the most new people for your product at that given moment. So I don't think there will be like one set of data that is the most useful for you. Rather, that's going to change over time as the company evolves in terms of which data you'll want to zoom into.
And I was also wondering
Right.
how if there is a specific timeline for data. So let's say, for example, data that was collected 10 years ago, obviously that won't be as reliable as it is today, but just for new findings or to back up new theory, would that help?
Yeah, I'd say that really the relevance of data really depends on sort of like the changing context and how, and just like I think it's a very specific question to any given data set and any given product, right? So like, for example, for you folks, if you had something data that was really relevant from 10 years ago, even if it's really relevant in many ways, it wouldn't actually be relevant because the consumer landscape is just completely different with like apps and the prevalence of smartphones and post-COVID, et cetera. Versus on the flip side, you could have data from a few years ago in a very similar situation. You can imagine if there was a situation like in another university or like a very similar context, and even if it was not data that you've collected, and even if it's not new, it could still be very relevant. And I think it's just a matter of figuring out, are the consumers that you're looking at in these two data sets, in your context and in the other data set, are they the same consumers? Have those consumers changed enough that data is not relevant anymore, and sort of figuring that out. And obviously like companies themselves over time, right? Like a year from now, maybe your consumers will be exactly the same, or maybe you'll be looking at different people as consumers and the early data you collected won't be as relevant. And yeah, that will really depend on how consumer bases change, both in terms of who you're reaching and trying to reach, and also whether people are changing in that time in their patterns.
And that brings me to the point that we at Coubon take this very seriously about people's rights and people's privacy, which is why we only take as little data as we need to make their service better. Even that, we give them an option. For instance, if they don't want to show their location, we won't take it, and the app will still work perfectly fine. But obviously, the more data we have, the better we can, customize it for you. Moving on to generative AI, the hot topic of today. How do you see it? Do you see it as a boon, or do you see it as a curse? And where do you see us in it?
Yeah, I feel like obviously any new technology is both a blessing and a curse typically. I'd say in the case of generative AI, I think the important thing is understanding what generative AI is good at and what it's not as good at, right? So generative AI is really excellent at tasks that if you just took a smart person and gave them enough time, they could do that task. So for example, if you want to really target the way that you're talking about your product to different people, generative AI, if you have the data to go into that sort of model, can be really useful because you don't have time to write out different versions of everything for 1,000 different consumers. But generative AI obviously can do that. So things that if people had enough time, they could just do, it's really, really excellent at. What it's not as good at in a lot of cases is more creative tasks and things that people haven't already come up with, because obviously it's looking at a corpus of what's already been done. So it's very rarely going to be particularly creative. It might get something, it might see something, in its corpus of things that have happened in the world that a person didn't see, and that could like sort of look like creativity because it might be something that you didn't think of, but it's not going to be generative of ideas really. And I think that that's something that like people, to the extent that people try to lean on it for that, I think we'll get less sort of interesting outcomes because AI is not going to sort of like break the mold and think of something completely different that hasn't been done before. But for lots of marketing contexts, all you need is something that a smart person with a lot of time could do, right? So I think that things like targeting and sort of messaging and figuring out how to communicate to different people differently is the sort of thing that there's a lot of potential for generative AI for, that I think people are still sort of working out how to leverage that, but I think there's a lot of potential there.
So a couple of things, we are quite ingrained in AI. So one of them being, as I said before, the chat box. And that's very interesting because unlike other apps, which may just say recommended, the restaurant is recommended, we rather give them a choice. So there'll be a chat box, you can write in what's a good place to go for a first date. Although I don't recommend, using a discount on a first date, but nonetheless, where should I go on a first date? Or I'm going with a group of friends, what's a good vibrant location? And the chat box will, shortlist a few discounts that we have from a few of our partner restaurants. That's one of the main things which I'm very excited about, and it should be available in the next few months. And other than that, we've also used data analytics and generative AI to help code parts of our application, which makes it more smooth and more seamless. So yes, I mean, I think in my opinion and in the opinion of many of our college peers, I think it's a boon, especially also writing essays in lectures. I know you probably have a problem as a professor distinguishing which is which.
You would think that, but actually, AI writes good B essays. AI does not write good A essays. So my advice for you and all of your listeners who are students is if you want an A in a class, AI is not going to get you the A. AI is good at pulling stuff from the internet, not good at being thoughtful, which I think goes back to sort of what I said before in terms of like creativity, like really thoughtful. Is not what it's great at, but like, yeah, recycling things online is what AI is really good at.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you completely, which is why I didn't use AI, and that's how I got an A in marketing. So I recommend all my audience members to not use AI, especially in their lectures. Now, the final and I think the most important question: what's your view on Coubon and its impact on the local community? Obviously, you've lived in Toronto for a while and you know how expensive things get. So how do you think, we fall into place to help both students and restaurants?
Yeah, it seems like a great way to sort of match people who are, looking for, or they're a clear group that's going to be looking for a discount and also has really flexible schedules with local businesses, and hopefully have the businesses making more money and also have obviously students have these discounts. And I think also just for like creating like relationships between the student community and restaurants, I think that's a really great thing that can be harder when you're in a city like this, where there's so many people and there's so many restaurants. I think it's something that you see in a lot of universities that aren't in big cities, where there's a real strong connection between students and restaurants in the local community. And I think that something like this does have the potential to really strengthen those relationships and have certain restaurants be the ones that students sort of like view as the ones that like care about them and sort of like, yeah, have a relationship that isn't just like you give them money and they make you food, which I think can be a really nice thing in a community.
Absolutely agree. That was one of our main motivating factors to do all this. But being from New York, I tell you this, that I've got my eye on New York, and I'm getting Coubon there sometime or later. So
I hope so. There's also lots of universities in New York that you could work on partnering with students there and sort of getting it out further in that way.
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for taking the time coming for this podcast. I know in your busy schedule, this is really an ask, and I thank you so much for supporting a small business like us. And I'm sure my audience will love you enough, and we'll call you for our next podcasts and many more to come. So thank you, Professor, and great talking to you.